Just a minute here. So I think you even see in the upper part of the screen it says to you, for you, your benefit live on YouTube, right?
Yes.
So you can always check that if you wonder what the status is. Upper part of the screen it says to you, for you, your benefit live on YouTube, right? There you go. And I have to, it is okay. So a brief introduction would be this, that Brad and Jerry will take you through the founding of Oak Grove Cemetery in 1848 and the principles upon which the nonprofit non-denominational cemetery was based. They will look at who's who in the cemetery, challenges facing the cemetery today, their course of action, the need for collaborative relationships with other nonprofit organizations that share similar mission statements, and research opportunities that benefit the community. And I suppose I should also mention to all that this is the Falmouth Genealogical Society monthly meeting every second Saturday of the month. We have a guest speaker, and in some instances, those guest speakers allow a live stream like this to be given, and Brad and Jerry have agreed to that. So Brad and Jerry, you're welcome to introduce yourselves and tell us what you wish to get going.
Well, I'm Brad Jordan. I'm the superintendent of Oak Grove Cemetery. I'm going into my 4th year as superintendent, and I'm also vice president on the board of directors. The intention in the beginning for me was to come on as superintendent when Donna Walcovey retired suddenly, to get a handle on the job, what it takes, write a job description, and do some operational upgrades. And going through the seasons, I've learned to love this little job, and love the property, love the history of it. So there's a lot going on every day, believe it or not. And we're happy to be here to tell you about it.
Thanks, Brad. Jerry Luby. I'm president of the Falmouth Genealogical Society, as well as president of Oak Grove Cemetery Association. And I've been president there close to 2 years now. Oak Grove Cemetery is a special place where families can gather, pay respects to their loved one, and be at peace with the natural occurrence of someone passing. And as we walk through our presentation, you'll notice the 3 basic parts. We're going to chat about the historic significance of Oak Grove, the challenges facing Oak Grove and many cemeteries across the nation today, and the collaborative relationships that are needed moving forward, and with that, research opportunities. If we move to our next slide, Oak Grove, as Tim had mentioned, was established in 1848 by a group of prominent citizens in Falmouth. They set a committee to look for some land where they could establish a cemetery, and they did. Within a month, they identified 5 acres of land. As you drive into Falmouth on Palmer Avenue, you'll notice the big iron gates. And as you look through them, there's an area that sort of looks like it's a forest, but that general area of the cemetery is the old section. It was purchased for $250, and that donation was made by Elias Swift and by Oliver Swift. Interesting. They established it as a non-denominational private nonprofit. Now, the nonprofit aspect of it did not come into being until 1988, when actually it became incorporated as an association. But the non-denominational part was rather big at the time. I'm not saying there was religious persecutions, but there were distinctions within the village of Falmouth, and one of those most common distinctions was being a Quaker. You were relegated to being buried up in West Falmouth. And many of the villages within Falmouth worked the same way. If you were in North Falmouth, then you were buried at the North Falmouth Village cemetery. And this group wanted to be free from any type of questions or processes or procedures that related to religion, therefore non-denominational. We're 22 acres, and we're a garden cemetery. The aspect of being a garden cemetery, Douglas Keister wrote a book some time ago, Forever Dixie, where this individual sort of walked through a number of cemeteries, and he identifies there being 6-7 types of cemeteries. One cemetery is your graveyard cemetery, which is your city cemetery, typically unorganized, a series of stones, willy-nilly placed, and weeds growing usually all over the place. Another type of cemetery was defined as a churchyard cemetery. Now, those are explanatory by the name churchyard. Stones showed up around the church, people were buried. No sense of beauty or no sense of, how do you want to say, garden type environment. Then you have your third type, which is a garden type cemetery. In 1831, Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, they were the first cemetery established as a garden cemetery within the United States. Now that's amazing. Oak Grove was 18 years later. And the distinction is that they wanted to make it more park-like, more friendly, an area where families could walk, spend time with their loved one, and have the flowering azaleas and rhododendrons. Another type of cemetery is a lawn type park cemetery, which explains it's basically a field. You have memorial cemeteries, which is typically for pets. You also have them for specific type memorials where folks are buried overseas, but the family wants a marker placed. You have specialty cemeteries, and then the last cemetery is military. And I think the military cemetery, back in July of 1862, during the Civil War, Congress needed to do something. So they gave the president powers to purchase land for cemeteries. And at that time, they had purchased 14 such pieces of land for cemeteries throughout the country. Today, there are 146 national cemeteries, and of course, the most famous is your Arlington, that was created on the grounds of Robert E. Lee's ancestral home. It was also a very fashionable place to be buried, Oak Grove. And when you look at the stark contrast between a town cemetery back in the 1800s, where you would find, you'd find cattle, goats, sheep grazing in the cemetery to keep the grass down. But that naturally caused problems of folks wanting to visit a grave site. They would naturally have to clean their shoes off at that time. Our next slide, you'll notice some well-known folks buried at Oak Grove Cemetery. Catherine Lee Bates, author of America the Beautiful. Captain Weston Jenkins, famous. For those who follow local history, he essentially fought off the British from landing in Falmouth Village to ransack homes, collect food, and quite the hero. There's a whole story written on Captain Jenkins. We have Sylvia Donaldson. Now that's appropriate for today, or the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. She was the first woman in our state legislation, but she was also, for a short time, the first, Speaker of the House. Significant accomplishment in those years. We also have a Russian count and countess, Count Ivan Podorsky, a young fella back in Russia. He was about 17 or 18 years old. He was an officer on the Tsar's Imperial Guard and was awarded the highest honor, the Cross of St. George. I don't think he did his job all that well, naturally, the way things happened in Russia. But as time went on, he did immigrate to the United States, and he summered in West Falmouth, as a lot of folks had done in the early years. Brad, do you have anything to add to some of that?
We have many notables in the cemetery. That's a whole other lecture, and some of you have been on our historical tour, and we're constantly working to get more names of notables buried at the cemetery. But an example is President Garfield's son and his family are buried at Oak Grove. The Garfields had a summer home off of Mill Road. Also a significant benefactor to the cemetery and to the town, J.K. Lilly, is buried there. Many others.
Very good, thank you. Keep an eye on that particular slide where we show the nationally known folks, the monument to the right. That's a monument erected by the Grand Army of the Republic for those memory of those who had died in the Civil War, and we're gonna touch upon that a little bit later. The next slide shows a great little photo of Hootie. Now, this is perhaps not nationally known, but Brad, you were the first to identify Hootie. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, there's been a family of hawks living in the middle of the cemetery ever since I've been on the property, and I've enjoyed watching them. I feel that I've become their friends. And I noticed early this spring that they weren't flying around, and I can see the tree that the nest is in right out my office window, and I saw some great big ears sticking up. And then a couple of days later, I saw a photographer with major equipment taking photos, and I introduced myself to him. He was Mike Tucker. Many of you may know him. He lives in Woods Hole, and he also manages the Facebook site Falmouth and Photos. And he told me all about the owl. We kept it hush hush for a while. We didn't want to bother them, but more and more people came onto the property and discovered them. And by the time they were juveniles, we would have crowds of people there taking photos. They've flown the coop for the season, but it looks like it was all successful, and we hope to see them again next year.
It's a great photo there with the mother and the two chicks. Very interesting. The founding principles established back in the early 1800s was to maintain a serene garden environment, to maintain a natural habitat for nature's way. That was their way of inviting nature into the cemetery. They wanted leaders of the cemetery to be good stewards of our historic presence. And when one walks around the cemetery, it truly is a time capsule of history. And one can move from the old section up near Palmer Ave all the way back 22 acres. And there's a tremendous amount of history in the area. They also wanted to have cost-effective internment services. I think that's a valid point. And then to maintain operations basically forever, in perpetuity. They felt it important that when the last lot was sold, that there be some means to maintain the cemetery. And with that, an endowment fund was established, and due to the benefits of many folk, we have funds that are growing. And as a operating cemetery, we do put 2% aside of our revenues every year to continue to support that fund. Anything, Brad, to add to that?
Yeah, I will add, for those of you who do get the Oak Grove newsletter, Mike Tucker did write an extensive article about the owls and their presence and a little bit about them. And that article will be in our newsletter, as well as we will post the newsletter on our website, probably mid to late August. So take a look for it. And if any of you want to be on our mailing list for our newsletter, send me an email. at ogcfalmouth@gmail.com, and we'll be glad to put you on the list.
Very good. Thanks, Brad. Our next slide talks just a little bit more about the cemetery. We are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Not an easy accomplishment, and it was very difficult process filling out the various applications. And I was not part of that, but many of our board of directors in the past have been. And even to this day, we show we're 22 acres, but in reality, we could only find about 18.9. And the lawyers at the time recording and registering and researching down at the deeds felt that it would just cost us a tremendous amount of money to try to nail it down. It's more like, you take 22 paces till you get to the old oak tree, then you turn right at the boulder, and then 5 paces to the left. I mean, it's one of those areas where folks have bequeathed land to the cemetery. And over the years, some of the sand pit bordering one side has encroached upon it to some degree. Just an interesting point. The Grand Army of the Republic Civil War Monument is one of the very few on the Cape. And I think it's worth to note here that I always make a distinction when I'm thinking of the past. I refer to Falmouth as the village of Falmouth, more so than the town. But you go back 120 years, the town folks would come out in force. I'm talking 200 or 300 folk along with veterans, and they would celebrate Memorial Day. Now, Memorial Day wasn't really, official, until the, it was around 1960, 1970s. But they would come out, and folks would speak at the Civil War Monument, and then they would proceed to put flowers down on veterans' graves. And that putting down flowers eventually then turned into putting flags down. Until today, we celebrate the Memorial Day by placing flags on our veterans' stones. And interesting, it went so long. Elizabeth Park Chapel. Elizabeth Park had made a donation back around 1934 of $4,000, and she wished to have a chapel built in the cemetery with those funds. A chapel was built in the Greek Revival type architecture. It holds 60 folks. It's non-denominational, which is, again, what they wanted. So folks can have services in the chapel, and it has proven itself to be very useful over the years. Anything to add to that, Brad, or so?
Yeah, through the years, there's been one significant restoration of the interior of the chapel about a decade and a half ago. And we've been doing recent improvements to the building, such as last year, we finally retired our old oil burning furnace that was chugging along and installed new heating and air conditioning. We haven't had the opportunity to use that yet this year because of the health emergency. The building is temporarily closed, but we're looking forward to having that resource for people to use.
Good. The last bullet on there is an interesting one for many of you who may not realize it, but there's a whole story around President John F. Kennedy's memorial at Arlington. To touch upon that, the Oak Grove Cemetery had a receiving building. Years ago, when someone died during the winter months, you could not dig the soil. Of course, it was all dug by hand. So they were placed in this receiving building. Well, that building sat in the area as you look through those iron gates off of Palmer Avenue and look straight ahead. There's a bit of a grotto. A lot of us refer to it as the punch bowl, but that's where this receiving building stood, and it was built with Falmouth pink granite. over the years, it became in disrepair, and it wasn't, I believe, sometime toward the end of the 50s, early 60s, that it was raised, and old man Baker ended up purchasing the stones and stockpiled them in his backyard off of Jones Road. The story goes on that the Kennedys, both Jacqueline and John both, would visit Falmouth quite frequently, and they would love going to this one antique dealer. One day, when John had passed away, Jackie did not like the place at Arlington where John was buried, and made plans to have his body exhumed and moved within Arlington. Much of that story I never heard, and I think they kept it quiet for a lot of reasons. Well, the family had come into Falmouth, and they were visiting with the antiques dealer and noticed the stone step coming into the antique dealer's shop, and they inquired about it. And they, knowing what Jackie was planning, felt that piece of granite was something that they would love to have. And it turns out that was Falmouth pink granite. So they asked where they could buy it. They bought it from old man Baker. And in the hush of night, the stones were removed from Falmouth, and they were brought to Bobby's farm, where they were laid out. And that Falmouth pink granite is now the patio stones in front of the John F. Kennedy Memorial at Arlington. But not the end of the story. They also needed a stone with a hole in it that could hold the perpetual flame. And so they went back to the dealer, and he pointed them in a direction of Woods Hole, where an individual did have a piece of pink granite with a hole in the middle. They obtained that piece and also inserted it into the patio area. The story does go on, but that is granite that was quarried in Falmouth. And it's the type of granite that was loosely placed close to the surface. And the vein runs on the other side of the street from the cemetery, all down through West Falmouth. An interesting story in itself. I don't want to bore you on that, and I probably have talked enough here. Brad, why don't you take the next few slides, if you would? Thank you.
Sure will. So we're looking at burial statistics in the cemetery as it relates to historic significance. And this is where there is a lot of research to be done here right now and in the future. Being started in 1848, and not related to any entity per se, just an organization, there were many years through time that the cemetery had management or didn't have management at all. So records are pretty few and far between from some of the decades or from some of the earlier years. Now we're totally automated. Our database is now stored up on the cloud, as they say, and we're able to access our database from many locations other than the cemetery. You all know the saying, garbage in, garbage out. So we do have a lot of inaccurate information in the system that we're working to clean up, and that involves research. We have over 10,000 graves on our grid, on our 22 acres in our system. And that 10,000 graves does not use up all of the 22 acres that we have. Our records show that we have about 5,110 people buried in the cemetery. Many of the lots in several of the sections, particularly of the older sections, there are graves in family plots that were originally owned by these families that have never been used. They still are available to be used. Nowadays, in the oldest sections of the cemetery, we only allow cremations, but sometimes we do get communication from the older families wanting to do burials now. And some of these families don't even realize that they own graves at the cemetery. Up to the current times, a lot of our owned graves are abandoned by families because they're buried in other places, or maybe not buried at all. And also the construction of the Otis Cemetery, the National Cemetery, took a lot of burials, potential burials from Oak Grove, and they're now over there. You'll see that we have in our records 557 veterans listed, but we know that can't be accurate. And this is where a lot of fun research comes into play, finding out who these people are. When you just think about it, starting in 1848 and all of the wars that we've been through from then until now, you know that there must be significantly many more veterans buried at Oak Grove. We're thinking in the thousands more. So that's some research we want to do. This spring, we went through an audit in tandem with the Department of Veterans Affairs. They provide flags to us every year that we have the Boy Scouts place right before Memorial Day on veterans' graves. They do have a list of veterans on their list buried at Oak Grove. We do receive a stipend for the maintenance of those graves every year. And so it is to our advantage, not only from a historical aspect, but from an income aspect, to get this research done to figure out how many veterans we have. When we just did the audit this spring, we had volunteers, friends of the cemetery, and board members go out and audit the list that we have. Through the years and placement of flags, they've never been really maintained and picked up. Basically, Boy Scouts come in, replace the old ones with new ones, but through storms in the winter and in the summer, they blow around, people pick them up and they just place them. They look great, but we don't know if the flag represents a veteran. So we did go through each section, and we did remove flags where we couldn't determine that a veteran was buried there. Well, that became a two-edged sword, but in a good way. We did receive many complaints. Families called, they asked where the flag is that's been on their family member's grave for years and years. And we told them about the audit, everyone understood it. And with that, in the past several weeks, I've been gathering lots of information on veterans related to these graves that we didn't know existed. So we're actually growing the list just as a direct result of this audit that we have done. Jerry, do you have anything to add?
Well, maybe a couple of points. The computer system, when Brad mentioned garbage in, garbage out, there's a little flag that one sets if are you a veteran, yes or no. And that flag was basically turned off for many of the veterans. I think our list was 170 veterans, and the Veterans Department had a list of 270. But yet every year the Boy Scouts would place about 500 flags. That's what moved us forward. And this particular audit or review was what was a collaborative effort. A number of folks from the Falmouth Genealogy Society participated. Tim Martin, for one, Star Bartlett, Mary Berry. I mean, it was Ray Howe. Ray Howe developed the database for us that we could use and sort it in multiple ways to come up with this 557. One of the projects we'll chat about a little bit will be a continuation of this particular project. I think that was all I had on that, Brad. Yeah.
Sure. One little statistic I want to share with you. When you walk through the cemetery, particularly the older sections up near Palmer Avenue, you'll see many graves that are older than the date that the date of death was much older than the date that the cemetery was established. Going back to the slide where Jerry was talking about the fact that we're non-denominational and it was a fashionable place to be, what families did after Oak Grove was set up, they moved family members from the Quaker Cemetery or various cemeteries around the area into Oak Grove to be in a place that they would prefer at the time. Another statistic is we have many, many sea captains who passed away prior to the creation of Oak Grove, and they would have died at sea, been interred on other continents, and when their ship would come back years later, they'd be picked up and brought back and interred here. So we have many, many people there who are much older than the cemetery itself. Moving on to the next slide, just some interesting information in traditions and culture. Through the years, as you walk through the cemetery, architecturally, you see the difference in the makeup of stones and the way plots are configured, etc. That lots of customs have changed through the years. And our first lots were sold in 1850, starting at $1. Oak Grove's income comes from income from our endowment fund, as well as fees for services and the sale of lots. So through the years, lots were sold and burials were done, and that income to pay for all of that would help maintain the cemetery. Through the years, prices really didn't go up that much. When Jerry and I came on board, we started looking at pricing much more. And we now do a competitive analysis every few years of cemeteries in the area, as well as looking at the Boston area too. And the reason why we look at the Boston area, believe it or not, it's my estimate in the summer, probably about 1/3 of our burials are for people who have never even lived in Falmouth. We have a high rate of burials for people who simply vacationed here their whole life and loved it, or had a family vacation home in the area. And some of these families now are buying family plots and for their entire family, even though they don't live in the area. So when you do an analysis of our pricing and pricing in the Boston area, we're still a significant deal for those families. So we started at $1 in 1850, and a normal casket lot now sells for $1,400. But another statistic that's come about is we're now looking at the fact that as of last year, about 65% of our burials were cremations as opposed to caskets. This year, that rate is going to be much, much higher. And my theory on that is it could be a result of the epidemic and the inability to hold funerals in the past several months, as well as families cannot travel to attend a memorial or a burial. So I just looked at the Enterprise this weekend to see that I think only 1 or 2 of the obituaries showed where an actual burial was going to happen. The majority of them are showing that it will be at a later date. So with that in mind, the statistics showing that we're up to 65%. When I first came on as superintendent, I did an analysis to show that we had about 49 years left of life with current burial statistics and the land that we have available. But now with the cremation burials, we've actually designed and built 2 cremation sections. We call them cremation gardens, which will have a patio, benches, and little 3x3 lots that will hold up to 2 cremations. And we're selling those lots for $900 a piece. And then we have another section up closer to our entrance where those lots are selling for $500 a piece. So looking at our revenue is much less just because of the current custom of cremations, which we don't feel is going to go away. Jerry, do you have anything else to share on that?
No, I think that's a valid point, and that basically is one of our major challenges. It's the same challenge that your funeral homes and directors face in terms of the cremations are a lot less money than a traditional casket type burial. Naturally, the other major influence or challenge for the cemetery is this whole concept of the National Cemetery and Bourne. That was a significant impact on most cemeteries in the geographic area. And most cemeteries do rely on the selling of lots to maintain those properties. It works out to, when you do the calculations, it's probably a loss of close to between 25 and 30% that one has to make up. And when you think about making that up, you're thinking of the old days where you were a buggy maker, or you had a leather goods shop and you made whips and you made the leather for the leather seats or the harnesses for the horses. And now all of a sudden these automobiles come along. It's a dynamic shift. And you sort of turn around and you look at how can we, look for new sources. And I got to tell you, an area that surprised me is donations and memorials. We decided that we would put a number. We would put the roads up for sale by having donations made of putting a name on the road, and an individual makes a donation for that effect. Brad pioneered that, and we've made up a good portion of the money by technically selling roads. Brad, I'll refer that back to you.
Yes, Jerry, I'm also on the second challenges slide, since you're not seeing what I'm doing. It's very, very intriguing to watch the sales of roads. What we've determined is how important it is for families or individuals to have their legacy known. And we were very, very surprised to see that people were willing to make donations to have their name on one of our roads. And they're not cheap. Our longer roads sell for a donation of $5,000, and our shorter roads a donation of $2,500, and they are selling. It's kind of fun talking to these people and getting to know their history. And it's just part of the legacy of the cemetery. Another trend that we're seeing is that many people being cremated aren't buried anywhere. They're scattered in a place, kept at home, or scattered at sea. We have people coming in asking if they can do a memorial for their loved one who isn't buried. So we do now have a memorial garden next to our cemetery, next to our chapel, where you can buy a plaque or a bench with your family member's name and on it, and just as a place to go to touch base. And then people are now asking for columbariums. They're very popular in more of the metropolitan areas. It's something that we probably have to take a look at in keeping with trends. Keeping with trends is part of Oak Grove's history. As you walk through the sections, you see, they look different in each section. When we install columbariums in the future, we're starting to talk about that. We want to also maintain the historic integrity of the property and its architecture and its history. And then another challenge that we have related to history is the maintenance and restoration of the older plots and graves and gravestones. When you go through the property, you see many fallen on the ground. They fall consistently. I ran into one just this past week that we had to upright. This fall, we're going to collect the fallen stones to the most regard and store them in a safe place until we can figure out how to get funds to restore the graves themselves. Some of the older families are still active in the cemetery and in their family plots in the oldest sections. And ultimately, it is the family responsibility to maintain their section. But in many cases, we have no communication with ancestors or current members of families. So we're looking at ways to do that restoration to maintain our historical integrity. I'm moving on to the next slide, Jerry. So in solutions, we are looking for solutions to, I'll put these up. So we're looking for new sources of revenue, and amongst what we're looking at is being more public. A lot of local people don't realize that Oak Grove Cemetery has 22 acres. You drive by the Palmer Avenue side and see a closed gate, an old cemetery, you think that cemetery is closed. You drive by on our Jones Road entrance side, and you look up the hill and you think we're a little cemetery that ends at the top of the hill. Many of our local residents don't realize that we have a beautiful chapel on the grounds and the park light setting. But what we're seeing this season, and I think it's a result of the health emergency, is people are reflecting. We're seeing more traffic on the property than ever of people coming to visit. We also have a large number of people doing walking or running through the cemetery, through the roads. In talking to a few of them, we try to get to know everybody. And they're saying, well, the roads are crowded with people walking. We can't social distance. The bike path is very difficult to be on right now. And they have discovered Oak Grove. We're happy about that because now they ask questions about Catherine Lee Bates and who's buried there. And they notice we have a lot of sea captains, and they email or approach us when we're on the property to talk about us, that with us. So we feel it's beneficial to generate greater visibility in the community and the history that we have. We are also now advertising something Oak Grove really didn't do before. Knowing that many people don't know about us. You'll see our ad in the paper. Once the chapel is open again, it's a beautiful facility, very beautiful inside, very spacious. It's a great place to have a memorial. Also, we are wanting to encourage the public in general to use the chapel for a recital, for a class, even a wedding. We've had a wedding in the chapel in the past. And also to provide good service that will bring people onto the property. And then we have our annual appeal newsletter, which has a very large following and has some interesting articles about history in it. Jerry, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think you've covered those very well, Brad. Very well. If we could move on, we have our next is collaborative relationships. Now, that's just a big word for essentially working together. And one of our, I guess you'd call it best relations, has been with the Falmouth Genealogical Society. Well over 10 years ago, members of the society, and many are still with us today, took on a project within the town of Falmouth to gather data on burials within each of the cemeteries in Falmouth. Believe it or not, there were close to 20 cemeteries in the town of Falmouth, and not including one Indian burial cemetery up in North Falmouth, which naturally there are no markers in that cemetery. And the society went out, they took photos of graves, documented those, we put them on a database, and it was available via an index record. And we continued that up until we ended up building a new website. And at that time, we were making the decision, do we continue with these databases, or should we just point to find a grave? And believe it or not, during that period, as we were gathering information, find a grave essentially had about 70% of what we had already collected. Anyways, it's a long-term relationship, and there is a couple of projects. Ralph had brought up the fact at our board meeting that we probably should look into continuing, since we didn't complete the project at Oak Grove. And so Ralph, Tim, myself, Ray, we're looking at how to put together an overall project and lay it out. In other words, we have a list of the 5,000 burials there. We need to do a review against Find a Grave to determine, which ones are not, have been photoed, and then proceed with a plan to gather those photos. Once completed, we would then provide Find a Grave that information. But that's one project, a collaborative project that is very beneficial for both organizations, as well as the town of Falmouth. Another organization, the Community Preservation Fund, CPC Fund, we've received grants over the years, and those grants have been very beneficial. We have restored well over 21 War of 1812 soldier stones. We've done a large number of Civil War stones in the same point. And that is, some of the obelisks were tilting. They had to be dug up, moved, new foundations placed. A significant amount of work, but that it continues, and there'll be other grants moving forward. A new relation has popped up this past year. As I mentioned, the Grand Army of Republic monument early on. Well, that monument and that piece of property was purchased by the Grand Army of the Republic, an organization, a local organization, most were at the time. Now, the organization's charter was such that when the last Civil War veteran died, the organization died. Not so well thought through, as you could imagine. So through an act of Congress, the organization that inherited the Grand Army of Republic was the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And their charter is written that it continues well beyond, and it includes relatives, naturally, of those who have passed away in the Civil War. And we have a unique situation where research is necessary, is that monument allows 20 lots. Only 2 Civil War soldiers are buried there and one other. And that leaves 17 lots. So for the last 100 years, nobody has been buried there, and they've been available. So we are working with the Veterans Department as well as the Sons of Union Veterans Organization to determine perhaps we could put 1 or 2 well-placed columbariums and increase that 17 casket lot site to something up close to 70 or 80 cremations, and used for veterans, exclusively for veterans. It's a significant project, and I think it's well needed. There are a number of veterans who are excluded from being buried at a national cemetery for one reason or another. The other aspect of collaboration is when you look at the cemetery as a whole, the history aspect of it, and we receive numerous requests on a regular basis for some genealogy research. I'm a member of the Swift family, and I want to bury my sister there. Well, we don't know that, and we can't allow that burial to take place unless there's some proof or genealogical, bearing that could be placed on it. And one thought in chatting with Tim and Ralph both is that we could utilize the help session folks, that when we receive these requests, we could, place them out on the website using that button I mentioned on the front page. and then schedule research. And then folks within the society who are looking for a challenge, this would be an opportunity to utilize one's skills. So it's a need across the board. I think those are some of the major areas of collaboration that we have. And of course, we want to continue searching for additional veterans in the cemetery. There has been many folk coming in and other organizations, the Masons. They have identified a number of their folks and have placed flags and markers. The Falmouth Fire Department, Police Department alike put flags down on those departments as well. I think we've probably covered most of those areas that need to be reviewed. Why don't we address any questions folks may have at this time? Tim, can I turn it back over to you?
Jerry, this is Brad. If it's okay,
Yes, Brad.
I'd like to add one more thing.
Sure.
When we talk to people from all over the world doing research on their families, and it's more and more now, especially now where a lot of people are home and they have time to be doing this and they're doing things that they're interested in. But one thing that will help you all doing your research is every time we connect with one of these families with historical grave sites, we gather as much information from them about what their relationship is to the family, contact information, etc. So we have a lot of information that we're adding constantly to our files on these historic burials that you may not realize that we have. So feel free to contact us anytime if you're researching somebody. We may have some more information for you and possibly get permission from a family to talk to you on that. We are also looking at adding an enhancement to our system to have certain members of the Genealogy Society have access to our database, limited access to look up burials. And we'll have more on that in the near future. Back to you, Jerry.
Very good, thank you. I think we started out by talking a little bit about the historic significance of the cemetery, the challenges facing it, and of course, some of the collaborative relationships that we do have and want to expand. On those collaborative, we would love to get more involvement with other organizations in town. You know, the Falmouth Historic Society, to name one, the Garden Club, well, St. Barnabas is another organization. They, believe it or not, have a archive that is loaded with genealogy, primarily from the Beebe family. They're the ones who built the church. But there are other organizations in town that it's my goal is to try to group some of those organizations, meet with them, and look at areas where we can find a value proposition that works for both organizations to bring further value to the community as a whole. Tim, I'll turn it back to you for any questions.
There you go. I turned my microphone on.
Very good. Thank you.
Great. Listen, something occurs to me here, and that is, and we've talked a lot about research opportunities, and this group that's before us right now is in fact the Falmouth Genealogical Society. And I want to encourage any of you who would like to be a part of, these research opportunities of different sorts, that appear. Let me put my face on the screen. How about that? There you go. Contact me, and certainly it might be a good idea to say what sort of topics you feel like you can address, but it would be a good idea for us to increase our list of, research volunteers. And, we're not, certainly our policy is not to take on huge projects. They're limited scope, manageable, definable, research goals is what we're willing to fulfill. So if you want to be or feel like you can be, or even if you think you want to be brought alongside and see what it's like, please, contact me, and we can get going on that, because we do want to serve the community in these ways. So how about people, let's try if people can press their space bar or unmute themselves by some way. If you have any questions, I have a question, I'll just let someone else speak first here. Any questions to Brad? Okay, go ahead, Dottie.
No, I was just going to say this was really a very interesting and comprehensive talk. And when, I'm sure you've thought of this, but when you go out to those other organizations, you've got this video that you can share with them for further info.
Yes.
Good point, Dottie.
All right, I'll jump in with my question. I think it was Brad who mentioned sea captains who died while at sea, and maybe they were interred elsewhere, and they had been brought back at some later point for burial. I'm just wondering, do you have, just to pick your brain a little bit, so you actually have instances of that at Oak Grove, or?
Yeah, I don't have any specifics with me. I wasn't prepared to discuss that today.
Sure.
It's something that we do discuss on our tour itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm guessing that like a ship captain might be more likely to be treated with to receive such treatment, and the lower ranked people might just be left at sea, right? And isn't that your sense of it?
Yeah, that's basically when I've been a student of our seafaring men for a number of years, and typically, yeah, those sailors are buried, but the captains, in their last wish, many times will want to be pickled, or they will be placed at a vat of their grog or their wine to to preserve them to some degree, and be shipped back home. But yes, yeah, there are a number of stories. There's two or three whereby the first mate, for example, as the ship was passing through a storm, your captain died, many of the other officers, and it was left up to the individual to bring the ship home. And we've got some of those stories, and they're truly fascinating.
Yeah, my wife has some ship captains in her lineage, and we have one of the books of prayer for one of the ship Memnon with Captain Baker, and that book, it's clearly the most utilized portion of that book. The spine is broken open at the burial service, for those at sea. That was the most utilized part of that book of prayer.
Tim, there are some questions in the chat area.
Oh, good. Thank you for drawing that to my attention. Okay, let me pick those up. Here is from one person. Have you digitized your records? For example, I am familiar with a cemetery that has death journals by date, name, what lot buried in, date died, date buried, etc. Is that sort of thing only on paper or digitized as well? And I guess they're asking for Oak Grove in particular.
I'll answer that question. Yes, we are completely digitized, but the older the burial, the less information we have in the system, because we simply don't have the information up front. Sometimes when we have a need to determine eligibility for a burial in the older section, we have many records in our chapel basement, which actually has a walk-in vault, such as a bank. And we go in there and have some original records that we'll research through. And then whenever we complete that research and find something new, we always add it digitally to that particular burial. So such as I mentioned before, whenever we talk to families and gather new information, get veteran information, etc., we're adding that to the system digitally. Also, if we have articles on people, write-ups, obituaries and such, anything, I encourage families to give us whatever they have. We can scan that information and upload it to our system. So in the future, when people are doing research, we're going to be able to share those documents or written information with people.
Brad, just to expand briefly on that, it's unfortunate that the cemetery, a number of years ago when they first went computerized, many of the original index cards were tossed out after they supposedly were entered into the system. And so a good deal of history was lost. And at some point, these death journals, we have a few in the vault, but a number of them at some point were given to the Historic Society. And one of our tasks is to just take a look at what type of data the Falmouth Historic Society has on Oak Grove. We have not done that. Well, we haven't done that, and we need to do that to get a better perspective, because those death journals themselves carry usually a significant amount of information.
Yes, we have death journals in the vault all the way back to the beginning of the cemetery. They're very cool. And this is where we sometimes need your help, is doing some research. We may not have something, and we just don't currently have the people power to do the additional research, to contact the Historic Society, etc. And sometimes we can use that assistance, or have an entity to refer someone to. Sometimes we'll make that referral, call the Historic Society, or they'll go another route and we never hear back again, and that's too bad. We'd like to complete that circle when we start the research to get that information into our system.
Here's another question. Has the cemetery considered putting a map and grave locations into an app like Names in Stone?
Well, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, preliminarily, no. That's something, though, we are wanting to expand our horizons on. We, in the last couple of years, built our website. That's a start right there. And then we're going to start putting links on our website to Find a Grave and other entities that do this sort of research. That's a goal moving forward in our future. And that's another thing we can use help from you all on where are the best places to get these links so people can complete their research, or we could complete our research.
No, Brad.
Tim, just to expand on that briefly, the system itself has a fairly robust database, and I will give credit to Ray Howe, who has taken that database and reorganized it for us. One of the next steps in reality is to take that database, incorporate a couple of apps in front of it to have a touch kiosk. And the vision that we have is to place that app on a kiosk located in the front porch of the chapel, so it's somewhat protected, but provide access to it. And that would give folks access to a search for a name, and then also a pinpoint via a series of maps, which our system does have that capability, and to locate where that particular grave is. Plus, it would provide whatever historic information that we maintain in the database. So I see something like that happening sooner than later. Yes.
One more thing we are working on, and we might have this within the year, is when you come onto the property, you'll be able to find a grave using your cell phone, getting GPS coordinates. The GPS coordinates will not be exact because the burial grid is not exact, being that the holes were shovel dug many years ago, but it will bring you within feet of a burial, not inches. I tried, we had a conference call with our database provider last week, and they gave us information on how to do that. It's a new feature. I tried it quickly last week. I wasn't successful, but we are working on it.
Yes, that's what I had heard, that your cemetery management system that this company has put together does have stored GPS tags.
Yes.
And man, with a cemetery that size, it helps hugely to get close to the right place. And allow me just to also point out to people that don't know that Find a Grave also has a capability. And if you have loved ones or at some cemetery somewhere and you visit their gravesite, if you have the Find a Grave app on your mobile device, you can stand at that gravesite and click a button and place a GPS tag for the location of that grave, so that in the future, people and your family members who visit that cemetery can find the grave using the Find a Grave app. You know, that refers to cemeteries anywhere now. And in my mind, that's just something that's so important to call attention to all us folks that visit graves, that we can tag the location for the benefit of others.
I want to add, just be aware, though Find a Grave is a wonderful website. It's not always accurate. We have run into situations where the burial will be in a completely wrong location, or they'll have a burial listed with us that's not even buried with us. So just a little caution. It doesn't happen often, but it happens enough for me to mention it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, because anyone can create themselves a free, can become a member for free, and they can create a grave anywhere about anybody, and they do that in error. You see, I had one other, I just wanted to I was pleased to see that Star Bartlett joined us, and I just wanted, I had a phone conversation with her recently, and I understand that she's a real, Oak Grove Cemetery tenacious researcher. And it's good to see that, I don't know, Bartlett, someday I'm going to talk to you and see, maybe you could give us a presentation that might be titled something like Amazing Stories That I've Dug Up at Oak Grove. I don't know if you're ever willing, but anyway, it's good to see her here. All right, no more questions? Okay then, next month, the second Saturday of the month, and you can always check our website at falgen.org, O-R-G, for this sort of information. Ralph Wadley will speak. Ralph, do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yes, we'll be looking at a 1840 era letter, which has come into my possession. And once I get a letter, I get very curious, and I go through the letter and dissect it. And so it's a genealogical exercise in bringing a letter to life. Who's in it? What's happened? And how did all these things in the letter work out?
Great.
If you're interested in that kind of thing, like I am, join the party.
Yes. Yeah, we had, just for people to know, we had about roughly 30 people in the, golly, what is this called? Zoom, that's it, in the Zoom session, and about 5 or 6 on the live stream during the course of this. And then October, as I referred to it much before, early on when several people weren't here, it looks likely that we will be able to have our 4 series of talks, one talk on every Wednesday evening of October at 7 p.m. via Zoom, a series of 4 Mayflower talks that will be, that's in association with the Falmouth Public Library and the Joy of Learning group that is affiliated. And we've been, it's great. They've asked us to host this, and we are very happy to put together an interesting group of speakers. So that's what I hope is going to be real for October. Keep an eye out on the website or your email. And I'll just leave it at that. But thanks everyone for joining. It was a great talk, Brad and Jerry, and everyone stay healthy and keep your research chops active.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.